The pie sat uneaten on the table, its crust barely holding together. May Langston wiped the dust from her hands, her children's hollow eyes watching closely, the winter winds howling just outside. By February, even the last of the canned peaches had long since been eaten, and May had no choice but to make do using what little flour she had left to bake a simple, useless pie. But what seemed like an absurd act of kindness would turn into a lifeline. Before we dig into May's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from, and if tales of survival and tough times resonate with you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just be one to outlast this one. May Langston never expected that the last harvest would be so small. By the time the crops were ready to be picked, the land had already swallowed its own promise. The dust had settled over the earth like a funeral shroud, turning what was once green into something dry, brittle, and lifeless. She remembered the soil, dark and rich, when they first arrived. She and Will, just young and hopeful, thought they had found their place in the world. But that was before the storms came, before the constant hum of the wind promised no relief. Now the only thing that grew was the despair in the pit of her stomach, gnawing at her. May stood by the window of their cabin, watching the children play in the dirt. They ran in circles, laughter weak but present, the sound barely reaching her ears as she pressed her hand against the glass. The sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, a reminder that the first real snow of the season would arrive soon enough. She had to act, and she had to do it quickly. The food was running out faster than she anticipated. The flour, the last of their sugar, and even the lard were disappearing, inch by inch. Will had been gone for days, the crops had failed completely, and the little money they had left was spent on trying to trade what little remained of the last harvest. They had sold what they could, but it wasn't enough. May sat at the table, staring at the remaining supplies. She thought back to the summer when she used to bake pies for the children, the scent of peaches, cinnamon, and butter filling the air. Those were days of relative ease, back when food came from the earth, and the family could laugh around the table. But now, as she looked at the small pile of flour, the remnants of sugar, and the dwindling hope of ever seeing Will's face again, May knew what she had to do. She'd bake a pie. It was absurd, of course. A pie wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring back the crops or the income they lost. But in this world of endless dust, of relentless wind, of starvation creeping at the edges of everything, it was something she could do. And sometimes, doing something, anything, was enough to keep the silence at bay. May rolled up her sleeves and began to mix the ingredients. The flour felt too thin in her hands, and she knew the pie would be a far cry from the delicate treats she once baked. But it didn't matter. She worked with methodical precision, ignoring the children's quiet stares, focusing only on the task before her. She didn't have the luxury of making a perfect pie, she only had the time before the cold set in, and another night passed without any sign of Will. The pie sat on the table, its edges brittle and the filling sparse. May cut a thin slice for each of the children, the smallest pieces she could manage without them noticing. The heat from the oven had long since faded, but the fire in the stove still managed to warm the cabin, a flickering comfort in the face of the world outside. The children sat silently, their eyes fixed on the pie, waiting for May to serve them. They had grown too used to quiet moments like these, to the rhythm of hunger and hope. May took a bite herself, chewing slowly, the taste too faint to be considered satisfying. It wasn't much of a meal, but she hadn't expected much. There had been no sugar for the pie crust, no butter for the richness. Just flour and a little salt. The children's gazes softened as they ate, and May's heart twisted. She had never wanted to feed them food that didn't give them the strength to grow, to run and play as children should. But this was what she had, and this was what she could offer. She wiped her mouth and cleared her throat, taking the last bite. The children finished their slices quickly, as if expecting more to magically appear. They didn't question her, not now. They had learned not to ask questions when the answer was always the same. There was nothing left. May heard a soft knock on the door, the rattle of it against the wind. It startled her for a moment, and she stood up too quickly, knocking her chair back with a squeal. Her mind raced, wondering if it was Will, if he had returned. She had held on to the thought every day he was gone, that somehow he would walk through that door and everything would go back to the way it was before the storms came. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Will. Standing there, face windburnt and tired, was Peter Johnson, one of their neighbors from a few miles away. His coat was covered in snow, his eyes wide with exhaustion. "We've run out," he said, his voice strained. "I can't find any firewood. We're running out of everything." May's chest tightened. She opened the door wider and stepped back to let him in. "There's barely enough to keep warm here, but you're welcome to share what we've got," she said, just for tonight." Peter nodded and stepped inside, shaking off the snow. May motioned for him to sit at the table, where the children were already beginning to whisper amongst themselves. "I heard about your pie," Peter said, his eyes scanning the room. "I didn't think you had anything left." May lowered her head. "It's not much." But Peter, shivering from the cold, didn't care. He sank into the chair with a tired sigh and stretched out his hands toward the fire. May's children silently watched him, sensing the change in their small world. "Anything's better than nothing," Peter muttered, warming his hands in the glow of the fire. May looked over at him, her heart heavy with the weight of survival. She had only thought to bake a small act of kindness, but somehow, in that moment, it felt like more than that. It was enough to keep someone alive, and in this desolate world, sometimes enough was everything. The winter stretched on, each day blending into the next with little to mark its passage. May didn't count the days anymore, it was the cold that told her time had passed. She woke each morning to the smell of burning wood, the only thing keeping the cabin from sinking into the bitter bite of the wind. The children had learned to play quietly, their laughter no longer bright but soft and muted, like the sound of wind rustling through bare trees. The dust was always there, seeping through the cracks, a reminder of how far away the world used to feel. May found herself thinking of Will less and less. She didn't want to admit it, but as each day passed without him, her heart began to erode, just like the land outside. The storms had stolen much from her, and the hope of his return had slowly turned to dust, just like the crops that had once flourished under the sun. Peter Johnson, too, had stayed longer than expected. After May offered him the small meal of pie, he hadn't left. His cabin, like so many others, was in ruins after the long months of wind and snow. He had lost his wife and children to sickness, and now he had nothing left but the will to survive. They'd helped each other, though the help felt more like a desperate sharing of misery than community. Every morning, Peter would chop the little firewood they had left, while May used the last of her flour to bake the same thin, dusty pie. It had become their routine pie for breakfast, and quiet work for the rest of the day. There was no music, no stories told by the fire, only the low murmur of their breaths and the flicker of the flames. May watched her children every day, wondering how long she could keep them fed. The pie was the only thing she could stretch, and even that was becoming too thin. The flour had all but disappeared, and the few cans of food that they had traded for firewood were nearing empty. But she could not stop herself from baking it. For them, for the children, for Peter, the pie became a small act of rebellion against the desolation, a piece of her own spirit, however fragile, that still fought to endure. The snow began to fall heavier in late January. Each flake seemed to bury them deeper into the earth, making escape impossible. May took to the kitchen more frequently, baking with what little flour she could scrounge from the sack. Sometimes the children would help her, mixing and stirring the bowl, their small hands working mechanically. They had stopped asking for better meals. Their hunger had become something they could live with, something they had learned to endure. One day, as May was kneading the last bit of dough, she heard a faint knock at the door. She froze, heart pounding, unsure whether to believe it. In this place, there was no room for hope, but when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. It was Will. His face was gaunt, his clothes tattered, his eyes distant, but it was him. It was Will. Will stood in the doorway, his breath visible in the frigid air. For a moment, May didn't know whether to cry or scream. She hadn't expected this. The long months of silence had numbed her to the idea of his return. She had built up walls of resignation and survival, told herself that she had to keep going without him. But there he was. "May," he said, his voice rough from the cold. I'm sorry." His words trailed off as he saw the small cabin, the half-empty shelves, the thin fire in the hearth. She stepped back, making room for him to enter. He stumbled over the threshold, weak and disoriented from the harsh weather. May didn't know what to say. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, yet now that it was here, the words felt insufficient. Her hands, which had so often kneaded dough, now reached out to hold him, to feel the warmth of him again. Peter, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up in surprise. Will's return shocked him as much as it shocked May, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only silent acknowledgement of what they had all been through. He nodded at Will, then left the room, giving them space. May led Will to the fire, where he collapsed into a chair, exhausted and worn. His cheeks were hollow, his clothes tattered and stained with dirt and snow. His hair, once dark, was streaked with gray. The dust from the land had settled on him too, but now May saw something else in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or relief, or something deeper she couldn't name. "I didn't think I'd make it back," he said, his voice cracking. "The storm, the food. I thought we were done for. I'm sorry, May. I should have come back sooner." She didn't know how to respond. All those months without him, and now he was here, like a ghost of the past, asking for forgiveness. But she didn't need his apology. The world they lived in now had no room for mistakes. They could only survive, and survival meant accepting what was broken and what could not be fixed. She placed a bowl of the last of the pie in his hands. It was all she could offer. The first breath of spring arrived slowly, as if the earth itself had to remember how to thaw. May stood by the window, watching the snow melt in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. The once parched land, though far from healed, was waking up again, little by little. It wasn't much, no crops, no abundance, but it was something. The barest hint of life. The wind still blew in gusts, cold and biting, but May could feel the change. The worst of the winter was over. Will, though still gaunt, was no longer the hollow man who had stumbled through the door months ago. His hands had regained their strength from chopping wood. His eyes, though tired, were clearer now. There were no more apologies between them, only the work of getting through each day. The children, too, were growing stronger. Their cheeks, once pale and pinched from hunger, had a faint flush of color returning. They played outside more now, in the last remnants of snow, their laughter filling the air. It was different from the hollow sounds of their muted games in the winter, and it made May's heart swell with something unfamiliar hope. Peter, who had stayed with them since the blizzards began, was out chopping wood one morning when May finally found the courage to step outside. It had been weeks since she'd gone out to the fields, weeks since she'd really looked at the land. The sight of it still struck her with its barrenness, its cracked, dry soil where only the memory of green remained. She walked out to the farthest edge of the field, where Will had once planted the first rows of crops. He had spent days, weeks, preparing the land, hopeful that the season would bring a harvest. But the dust storms came, and the land was swallowed whole, leaving only dry, cracked earth in their wake. She knelt down in the dirt, running her hands over the soil. It was stiff and dry, but she could feel it beneath her fingertips, the faintest signs of life, the earth's quiet resilience. This land had endured much, and so had they. The storms that had torn at them, the hunger that had nearly broken them, had only made them more rooted, like the very earth beneath their feet. May had learned that survival was not just about fighting the storms, but about enduring them, letting them pass over you like the wind. The soil would heal, she knew. It would take time, but it would heal. They all would. May stood up, brushing the dust from her hands, and turned to head back toward the cabin. As she walked, she felt a strange peace settle over her. They had survived. Despite everything, they had made it through. And that, she realized, was something to be proud of. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, May sat by the fire with Will, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. It was a quiet evening, the kind that used to be filled with the noise of worry and fear. Now, there was only the sound of the crackling fire, the soft hum of the wind outside. May looked at Will, his face still etched with the hardships of the past, but his eyes, for the first time in months, held something else, gratitude. "I don't know how we did it," he said softly, his voice low. "I don't know how we made it, through all that." May smiled, a soft, tired smile, and reached across the table to take his hand. "We didn't do it alone." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words hanging between them. It wasn't just the pie or the warmth of the fire that had kept them alive. It was the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of shared survival. It was the strength of each other that had pulled them through. Outside, the wind still howled, but May no longer feared it. The earth had weathered storms far worse than the ones they had faced. It would be a long time before the land would return to its former glory, but it would come back, just as they would. May didn't know what the future held, or how long it would take for the crops to grow again. But she knew one thing for certain: no storm could break them now. They had endured the worst of it, and together they would rebuild. And so, in the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by the dark, empty fields, May Langston finally allowed herself to rest, the weight of the past winter lifting off her shoulders. Tomorrow would come, and no matter how hard the world outside pressed against them, they would be ready.